I love to tell the story. 'Twill be my theme and glory to tell the old story of Jesus and his love.
Suffering is universal. You suffer, I suffer, we all suffer. Most of us suffer very little, except for brief periods when the suffering comes close to overwhelming us. We do not like it and don't even like talking about it. However, it is an important topic that requires our attention. Our story today is about a man who suffered from blindness for his entire life. If you were to become blind today, how would you react? Imagine that you had been born blind. What would your life be like today? Before we look at that man's story, let's consider the issue of suffering in general. Suffering is unpleasant. Suffering is often defined as the experience of pain, distress, or hardship, whether physical, emotional, or psychological. These experiences are not enjoyable, so we do everything possible to avoid or minimize them. Indeed, suffering is a bitter pill to swallow. Every religion and philosophy offers a way to understand and cope with suffering. For instance, hedonism teaches people to seek pleasure and avoid pain, viewing suffering as something to be eliminated or at least reduced. It is popular because the desire to escape suffering aligns with our human nature. But that is not what a Christian does. What if Jesus had decided to avoid the suffering of the cross? Suffering is inevitable. Suffering is an unavoidable aspect of life. There is always a storm approaching. You cannot exercise without risking injury. You cannot drive without risking an accident. You cannot trust without risking betrayal. You cannot love without risking being hurt. The Bible acknowledges that suffering is inevitable, linking it to sin and the world's fallen nature. It clearly shows that even the righteous endure suffering. This is exemplified by the story of Job, who faced immense trials while remaining faithful to God. The Bible suggests that suffering is an inherent part of life and can serve a greater purpose. It has the potential to shape our faith, character, and understanding. Our suffering also affects others. Steve Brown once noted that Christians suffer illnesses, relationship challenges, and financial crises just like non-believers do. This is so that the world can see the difference in how believers handle their suffering versus how non-believers do. Can the people around you see any difference in how you cope with your suffering? Christians are encouraged to view their suffering through the lens of Scripture, which can lead to a very different approach to dealing with it. The example set by Jesus. Jesus Christ's life and death are central to understanding suffering in the Bible. His crucifixion is seen as the ultimate act of redemptive suffering, offering salvation to humanity. Believers are called to follow his example by taking up their crosses, following Jesus, and trusting God's plan. They are encouraged to patiently accept the sufferings and hardships their confession of Christ may bring them. Perseverance in suffering. The New Testament highlights how suffering can refine character and strengthen faith. Paul writes in Romans 5, "We also glory in our sufferings because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance produces character, and character produces hope." God gives us the courage to persevere and walk through the storm. James encourages believers to consider it pure joy, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Suffering trains us in perseverance, standing firm in our faith until God reveals the next step. Hope amid suffering. The Bible is our lighthouse. It offers hope, the assurance that suffering is temporary and that eternal joy awaits. We need to keep our focus on God's word to arrive safely at our destination. Revelation 21 verse 4 assures us that God will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. Paul explains this in 2 Corinthians 4 verse 17, stating, for our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. The suffering is light and momentary, but the joy will be forever. Our hope in suffering rests in the assurance that God is present and has a plan to redeem and restore. We remain confident that He is faithful and will keep His promises. Comfort in suffering. We receive God's comfort in all our sufferings when we understand their purpose in our blessed fellowship with Him. At the beginning of 2 Corinthians, Paul writes, "All praise to God, the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. God is our merciful Father and the source of all comfort. He comforts us in all our troubles so that we can comfort others. When they are troubled, we can give them the same comfort God has given us. The more we suffer for Christ, the more God will shower us with His comfort through Christ. God comforts us in all our afflictions. No matter what suffering may come our way or what trials we may face, we can be sure of God's comfort. A primary purpose in leading us through such challenges is so that we can also comfort others who face the same afflictions, sharing the same comfort we have received. This is one of God's aims when He permits trials to come upon His children, that the consolation He imparts from the word of His grace may be a blessing not only to the afflicted but also to others who may not yet have reached the calm trust in God that should characterize a Christian at all times. Purpose in suffering. Through suffering, we are led into places we would never choose to go, but those places are part of God's plan for us. Those places are where we do many of the good works that God planned in advance for us to do. The Bible continually reassures believers that suffering is not without purpose and that God is present through it all. It emphasizes that God can bring good out of suffering, even when its purpose is unclear to us. For example, Joseph, after being sold into slavery and enduring many hardships, declares to his brothers, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." Romans 8 verse 28 assures believers that all things work together for good for those who love God, who have been called according to His purpose. In 1 Peter 1 verses 6-7, we are told, "In all this, you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while you may have had to suffer grief in all kinds of trials. These have come so that the proven genuineness of your faith, of greater worth than gold, may result in praise, glory, and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed." Your faith is proven to be genuine when you deal with your suffering as God has instructed. Dealing with suffering. We are not good ambassadors for God when we cry over our suffering, whining, "How could God do such a thing to me?" That is crying over spilled milk. Here are 3 basic steps for believers to cope with their suffering and move forward. The first step is prayer. Christians are encouraged to pray when faced with suffering, whether illness, relationship issues, or financial woes. However, we should not ask, "Why?" as the pagan does. That prayer is inherently self-centered and egotistical. It assumes that you are wise enough to understand God's ways, but His thoughts are higher than your thoughts. Instead, we should pray the more challenging prayer, "Not my will, but yours." Then, we wait for Him to give us our next step. This is how we learn to trust and obey. Next, Christians rely on God's sovereign care. Paul states, this happens so that we might not rely on ourselves but on God, who raises the dead. Reliance and hope are choices we make as disciples. Sometimes, we must exercise faith without feelings or signs of certainty or victory but knowing the greatness of His love for us. In times of disappointment, discouragement, depression, doubt, and deep weariness, we continue to trust in God's sovereignty. The popular saying, "Never doubt in the darkness what you knew to be true in the light," is particularly relevant here. Finally, persevere in faith, remembering that God's sufficient grace always meets our suffering. Whether our suffering arises from life's challenges, or a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan, we always have God's assurance, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." We find comfort and strength in understanding God's omnipotence and resting in His grace. There was a man in Jerusalem who suffered from blindness from birth. As a child, he could not run and play with the other children. As an adult, he could not work in the fields, so he had to beg from others to survive. Our story opens with this blind man begging at the temple. That is where Jesus and the disciples see him. When people see a person who is suffering in some distress, there are two ways that they might see him. They see him as someone in need of their help, or they see him as a pathetic figure unworthy of their attention. We probably have all been guilty of walking by someone without looking at them because we didn't want to see their suffering or be bothered with their plight. So when Jesus' disciples approach where he is sitting, which path will they choose? The disciples want to know why he is blind, so they say to Jesus, "Why is he blind? Who sinned?" There's that foolish why question, why? Why is he blind? They conclude that it must be from somebody sinning. Who is to blame? They seem to be trying to determine if he is worthy of their help. They want an explanation. And the common explanation of that day for suffering in a person's life was sin. Well, sin is the general cause of suffering in this fallen world, but it does not explain what God is doing. What is the purpose of this man's blindness? Was God's purpose to punish him for a sin he committed in the womb, since he was blind when he was born, or was it for some sin of his parents? This story can help us better understand God's purposes in suffering. We will find that they are more complicated than we have imagined. Now, sin is a huge problem in this world, and Jesus is quick to remind us of that problem. But he says that is not the issue here. This man's suffering is not because he sinned, and it's not because his parents sinned. Jesus says that the man was blind and had been blind all his life so that the works of God might be displayed in him. That's a different kind of explanation, because it doesn't give us a person to blame. It is important to notice that the word works is plural. There's always a lot happening, some of which we see but most of which we do not. And if God's going to explain why anything has happened, the purpose of any particular thing, our little finite minds could never grasp all that is involved in what is taking place and why it is happening. It is too complicated for us to understand. But Jesus says the man is suffering so that the works of God might be displayed in him. Let's look at a few of the many things displayed in this miracle that Jesus performs. Jesus reminds them, "I am the light of the world. And he who follows me is not going to walk in darkness." If they follow him, they will have spiritual sight. There are two things involved in seeing. We have to have the ability of sight and there has to be light. Anyone who's ever been in a cave knows that no matter how good your eyesight, when they turn off the lights while you are down in a cave, you don't see anything. You are blind. So we have to have two things. We have to have the ability to see, and we have to have light. Jesus is the light for those who have spiritual sight. Jesus spits in the dirt, makes mud, and puts the mud on the man's eyes, doubling his blindness. Then Jesus tells him to go to the pool of Siloam and wash. The man follows Jesus' instructions, goes to the pool of Siloam, and washes his face. This man can see for the first time in his life. This is the first of God's works in this man. Jesus shows, through this demonstration of his power, that he is the Son of God. Who can heal a man born blind? No one had ever been able to give sight to someone born blind. This is God at work. Next, we have a demonstration of God's grace. This man receives a great gift, relief from his suffering. A free gift is given to him. He's given the ability to see. He didn't do anything. Jesus just healed him. By God's grace, he was given physical sight, but he still doesn't have spiritual sight. Another thing happening here concerns the ordinary citizens of Jerusalem. What happened with all those people who have passed by him at the gate to the temple where he's been begging for all these years? Some people recognize him because they've given him money. They know him. They recognize him. How were their lives changed by this miracle? Well, we are not told. But it's not difficult to imagine that many lives were changed when they saw that this man was healed by this teacher, Jesus, who was claiming to be from God. This is a further demonstration of the power that's in Jesus' hands. Another thing we see concerns the Pharisees. They get involved because the people take this man to them. The people say, "You have to see this. You have to see what has happened here. This man was born blind but can now see." Well, the Pharisees, of course, are spiritually blind, so they are not thrilled by this claim. They challenge the man. They even bring his parents in, questioning them. But they did not believe that he had been blind. One of the subtle things here is that these priests and Pharisees had passed by this blind man for probably many years while he begged at the temple, but they were the people who wouldn't look at him. They couldn't recognize him, even though they had walked by him probably several times a day for all those years. They couldn't recognize him because they had no interest in a person like that. This event further hardened the hearts of the Pharisees. When this man is brought to the Pharisees, they have an opportunity to say, "Wait a minute. Something is going on here. We should check this out." But their hearts are hardened. And they cast the man out. This is basically excommunication, throwing him out of the family of the Jews. He has a new form of suffering. Jesus is not finished because the most important thing for this man who was born blind has yet to take place. He has his physical sight, and what a wonderful thing that is. We don't appreciate our sight enough, but he's been given his physical sight after all those years of blindness. Jesus finds him after he's been thrown out of the temple. And he asks him, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" The man is not sure who that is, so Jesus explains it to him. Then the man says, "Lord, I believe." He received spiritual sight, the opening of the mind to know Christ. That's even more important than having physical sight. Again, Jesus is demonstrating his absolute authority here. He is from the Father, and he not only heals this man, he gives him faith. When we suffer through fiery trials, and we will go through many more, we can find joy in our suffering. Wait a minute. Is that right? James says to find it all joy when you go through various trials. What? Count it all joy? If we truly believe God is working and God works all things together for good, then we can find joy in the suffering. But when we ask, why, we're playing the fool. We should never ask God, "Why did you do that?" because that's a very egotistical question to raise. Ask Job. That question implies that, "God, I am smart enough to understand it all, the big picture, how the whole thing works, if you'll just tell me a little bit more. Just tell me a little bit more, and I'll get it. I'm that good." That's foolish because we could never understand. Even in the story that we just looked at, consider all that God was doing with the blind man, his neighbors, the Pharisees, and the disciples. God was doing many things through that one miracle. Not one of those witnesses could see farther than his own nose, and what he did see was clouded by his prejudices. We are no better. When we ask the why question, we want a simple answer. One sentence, please. Not even a compound sentence, one simple sentence. That's all we think we need in order to know it all. We just don't get it. God is an infinite God who knows how to work all things together. We have a hard time trying to understand our own actions. We certainly can't keep track of the actions of all the people who are in our lives. But God can and does, and his purposes are met by meshing all that together to further his plan. We just can't understand it. So, why, is the wrong question. We should begin by praying the prayer we are not inclined to pray. Not my will, but your will be done. We may say it, but do we really mean it? If we mean it, we are ready to ask the question we should ask, God, what do you want me to do now? Now that this has happened, what do you want me to do now so that I can glorify you? And that's a very different question, and one that we're not so inclined to ask. But that's the question we must ask to make the most of our suffering.
I'd love to tell the story. 'Twill be my theme and glory to tell the old story of Jesus and his love.